want to speak about. The first approach to autistic spectrum I want to speak about is applied behavior analysis. It is the most popular approach to treatment. It comes from many years ago, even when I was in school, which was a very long time ago. This approach to treatment of children with severe and profound developmental disabilities was in vogue. The person who is most responsible for this is Ivar Lovaas. And ABA really stands for two things. It doesn't only stand for applied behavior analysis as an approach, but it really stands for the research protocol Dr. Lovaas used in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, when he received funding in California to try an operant intervention to individuals who were institutionalized. And back in the 60s and early 70s, institutionalization was the norm, so that individuals with disability were typically housed in institutions, which were barren type environments, almost prison-like. And as I think I explained in an earlier videotape or during a class session with you, my first experience my first job was at Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, which was an infamous institution here in New York. In any event, Dr. Lovaas received funding, developed a program, instituted the program, had significant success so that individuals who were not speaking prior to his intervention were in fact speaking after a year or so of his intervention. And then what happened was his funding was cut. And so he lost funding and he stopped his program. He left the institution. Then he returned several years later to find that all of the gains that he had made had evaporated, so that individuals who had been communicating when he had intervened and conducted his program, they lost the ability to communicate. So he got himself funded again and reinstituted his program. So ABA refers to a research protocol, an experimental protocol in which you provide assess a group who have not yet received treatment, then provide treatment, and then reassess, and then stop treatment and reassess again. And if there's a drop-off after treatment, when treatment is stopped, that's an indication that the treatment may have been effective. If you then reinstitute treatment and get a spike again in performance, then you have evidence that the treatment was effective, because without continuation of the treatment, there's a drop-off. With the treatment, there is improvement. Now, we could say additional things about this, such as, well, do you really need to continue treatment forever in order for there to be an effect? Is the effect generalized? But let's put that aside for a moment. And just recognize that ABA refers both to a research design and to Dr. Lovaas's program, Applied Behavior Analysis. It's the program ultimately that I want to speak about here, and applied behavior analysis refers to an operant again approach to intervention. And there are two things that I want to spend time with here. Number one, the curriculum, because applied behavior analysis typically follows a curriculum. And the fundamental components of the curriculum I'm going to share with you in a moment. I also want to spend a little bit of time with you on operant theory, or really the law of effect, on operant theory, the components of operant treatment. I didn't have time to spend with you in language acquisition. I know you had that course at the undergraduate level and perhaps at WKU. But I do spend a little bit of time in language acquisition going through the fundamentals of operant intervention. And the operant, it's really a law. There's such strong evidence to support it that it's not even a theory, it's a law concerning how the events that follow a behavior act to ultimately affect that behavior and really control it, potentially. First, however, I want to speak about the curriculum. So the curriculum, and if again this has been successful, I'm speaking to you from now from a corner of a PowerPoint, and you'll see the program sequence here. I'm looking at it on my other computer, which is to the left of me. And the program sequence includes the following. The idea being in operant intervention that you can first of all take a complex behavior, such as verbal behavior, which is the behaviorist word for speech and language, operant verbal behavior, and break it down into smaller components, and that if you achieve a smaller sequence of smaller achievable skills, you ultimately can build an actual complex behavioral system. So a typical ABA program sequence involves training children in attending skills, imitation skills, receptive language, expressive language skills, pre-academic skills, and self-help skills. The language component related components are primarily attending, imitation, receptive, expressive, and pre-academic. Now, what the approach, as you know, that our program or my program for language rests on the assumption that language is a tool for the expression. It's not really a tool, it's a part of the expression of content of mind. It's there because we as a species are conscious and we have intent. We have intent. That is, we have ideas in our head, things that we are thinking about, and we want to make those things public. We want others to know what's on our mind. It's really not a want in a conscious sense, but our system is driven to do it. We are driven to do it. And a term related to that I presented to you was intersubjectivity, a term that suggests that speech and language is social, and its function, bottom line, is to express what's on one's mind. Children are very self-centered, and so they really expect others to recognize what's on their mind without their having the requirement of recognizing what is on anyone else's mind. Ultimately, as we develop, we do recognize other people have minds and we have to pay attention to them. But young children are very much focused on expressing what's on their mind and having others read them. Children with language delay are no different. Their focus is on what's on their mind and its expression, and language serves that function. This is at odds. What I am saying now is at odds with an operant approach to intervention, where the focus of the approach is the curriculum. And that curriculum is not necessarily, the child's intent is not necessarily considered. Instead, it's the objective of the curriculum. So the attending component of the sequence is typically that the child is first taught to sit in a chair to the command, sit, and the child is rewarded for sitting. The child is then taught to make eye contact in response to their name and to the command, look at me. So the idea is that the child has to be able to attend to somebody in order to learn language, because language is ultimately internalized from others. That again is at odds with a point that I've tried to make in this course and in all of my courses, and that is language is supported by both information that's internalized from others, but also the way the individual organizes material, makes relationships, and that relationship making organizing comes from somewhere inside the individual, and it's likely genetically driven. Again, the focus in ABA is the internalization of information. So first addressed is attending skills, then imitation skills, and children are taught to imitate gross motor movements, actions with objects, fine motor movements, and ultimately oral motor movements. And I had a video to show you, but it's going to be very difficult for me to post that right now, but I will post that subsequently, where one of the teachers in an ABA program demonstrates rapidity of gross motor movements. But gross motor movements are things like clapping your hands, touching your head, touching your elbows, touching your shoulders, etc., standing up, sitting down, etc. Fine motor movements are things like picking up using a pincer grasp, or zipping or buttoning or something along those lines. At least something along those lines. Next comes receptive language skills. Kids are taught to follow one-step directions, identify body parts, eyes, nose, mouth, etc. Identify objects, show me the cat, show me the dog. Identify pictures, objects, then pictures. And finally, well, not finally, let me say next, expressive language skills point to a desired object or item in response to the question, what do you want? Another form of that is seen in the PECS Picture Exchange System program, another operant program, but something that I may have a chance to get to before the end of this term. PECS. In any event, expressive language skills, again, are the next things trained, and that is point to desired objects in response to the command, query, what do you want? Point to a desired object spontaneously, imitate sounds and words, and label objects. Lovas has said, he actually said it to me, that the key he feels to the success at developing language in children with autistic spectrum disorder is to teach them to imitate sounds and words. Verbal imitation, he said, if you can achieve verbal imitation, you will achieve language. If you cannot achieve verbal imitation, at the end of the day, you will not achieve language. And then the child then is, after verbal imitation, is taught to label objects. Some pre-academic skills that are taught typically are things like matching, often to the command match, and the child is asked to match objects to one or one out of an array of objects to the command match. For example, match, given say a cup, and the child has to match the cup to a matching object, a matching picture. Objects to objects, picture to picture, object to picture. Then complete simple activities independently, identify attributes such as colors, shapes, identify letters next. And then additionally, children are taught self-help skills. In any event, I just gave you one program sequence out of an ABA program. ABA programs follow relatively strict curricula. The idea being that a sequence, this particular curriculum sequence, ultimately will lead to both language and adaptive, the development of adaptive behavioral skills. I will next talk about operant technique. I'm going to stop right now, and that'll be on the next videotape. Okay, continuing on here, I want to discuss underlying processes that are assumed in an operant approach. Let me say an aside here. I'm not sure if any of you have worked in an operant program, in an ABA program. Often students get jobs working as ABA technicians, or I'm not sure any of you are certified as ABA instructors. But if so, I'm sure you have greater expertise than me in some of this if you've had some experience. I have to say that although I am a constructivist at heart and also a relationship-based type person, I do work always with operant theory in mind, or the law of effect in mind, and I use operant techniques. So they're very important. Do I buy into the curriculum sequence? Not exactly, but the use of operant techniques, absolutely. In any event, let's talk a little bit about some assumptions of operant theory, and which accounts for ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. First of all, the operant people do not talk about language, quite frankly. They talk about verbal behavior. And that is viewed as equivalent to any other kind of behavior, with a couple of exceptions. A verbal behavior is created out of operants. Operants, and the term operant refers to action that individuals express on the environment to achieve an adaptive end. For example, requesting something gets you something. Commands get you something. They get someone to do something for you. Comments might achieve things as well. Certainly, queries, requests, commands, responding to others do accomplish things. So they are operants. They're embedded in a social context, and therefore, from the operant point of view, the context that is the situation in which a behavior is embedded is extremely important, because control of behavior will be taken over by the context. We'll get to that in a minute. So verbal behavior is embedded in a social context. The only difference between verbal behavior and any other behavior is that verbal operants require people, another person, to mediate its reinforcement. We'll talk about reinforcement in a moment. Operant behavior, verbal operants require other people to mediate a behavior. So if I want to open a door and learn a door opening operant, I would grab perhaps a door handle, twist it, and push the door open and get out of the room. The door is not a person. It is a thing. That is not verbal behavior. And the fact that I managed to open the door, which was my goal, and get out, that perhaps would reinforce my door opening behavior. And I could tell that if in the future I do the same grasping, turning, and pushing. The door is not a person, but my behavior would have been strengthened by the consequence of the door opening and my leaving. On the other hand, if I want a cookie and it's out of reach, and I tell mommy, give me a cookie, and mommy gives me a cookie, now that give me a cookie behavior, which is a request operant. That was, if it continues in the future, we have evidence that that was reinforced, rewarded by a person, mommy, because it wasn't the cookie that gave it to me, it was mommy. And therefore, we can consider that request behavior a verbal behavior because its reward, the cookie, was mediated by a human being. Operant people do not buy into this idea of organization or what's on one's mind. The focus is observable behavior and the consequences that can strengthen or weaken it. And that is number 2 on this particular slide here. A key component of operant theory, or the law, it's really a law again, is this idea that contingencies are the thing that control behavior. Contingencies. What's a contingency? It's the event following the expression of the behavior. That serves to strengthen or weaken a behavior. If the consequence following the behavior increases its frequency in the future, if the behavior is repeated again, we can say that the consequence was a reinforcer. If, on the other hand, subsequent to the experience, the behavior goes away, we can say the consequence was a punishment or an extinguisher. I'm going to talk about punishment and extinction in a moment, but the major point I'm making here is that events that follow a behavior, consequences of behavior, in the context in which the behavior is expressed, serve to either strengthen or weaken the behavior, and thus behavior comes under control of consequences. And the entire technology of operant intervention has to do with designing consequences. We will also talk about antecedents and deciding what kinds of tasks can create a complex behavior that one is trying to teach. That is, we conduct a task analysis to determine what tasks, when they are all added together, will create, allow the learning of a complex behavior. We'll continue again in a moment with the next. Increases the frequency of behavior. It causes a behavior ultimately to be re-expressed again. It strengthens a behavior, a reinforcer. Now, there are 2 types of reinforcers. They are called positive and negative. Both positive and negative reinforcers strengthen behaviors. You may think that the term negative suggests that it makes a behavior go away, but it doesn't. A reinforcer is a consequence. It is something that occurs subsequent to a behavior, after a behavior, that strengthens a behavior. A positive reinforcement adds something to the individual, thus a token, that ultimately, or a sticker, perhaps a piece of food, a snack, when you're not really hungry, when the learner is not really hungry. Those are positive reinforcers. Saying good talking, good sitting, those are positive reinforcers. They're not something the individual really needs, but they are something that adds something to the individual, and if subsequently the behavior repeats itself, we recognize these things as positive reinforcers. There are also negative reinforcers. And a negative reinforcer is something that takes away a deprivation state. Something that takes away a deprivation state. Thus, for example, if you tell a parent, before the child comes to clinical therapy, to the clinic, don't feed the child so that your child is hungry. Don't give him breakfast. Don't give her lunch. Don't give her dinner. Bring her here hungry, because I'm going to be using food as a reinforcer. Well, That's a negative reinforcer. It's a negative reinforcer because the child is in a deprivation state. That is, the child's hungry. That child's uncomfortable. And when I give her the reinforcer, that is the food, for example, the hunger will get less. And therefore, we call this kind of a situation negative reinforcement. If the behavior that is being reinforced continues on subsequently. A reinforcer is only a reinforcer if it strengthens behavior. Now, a more nasty kind of intervention, negative reinforcer might be something like using electric shock to get a child to gaze at you. And thus you might apply an electric shock to a child when the child is looking away or doing self-stimulating somehow and not gazing at you, and shock the child. And as the child turns his head to your eyes, to your face, perhaps startle or to look for help, you remove the shock. Well, the shock puts the child in a deprivation state. The child's in pain, is uncomfortable. The removal of the shock takes away the deprivation. And thus, it is a negative reinforcer. If the behavior that it was attempting to reward or strengthen continues, so if subsequent to that the child comes in and looks first, establishes eye gaze, and the shock was there, the removal of the shock occurred upon the establishment of eye gaze, and eye gaze continues in the future, that is evidence that the shock, removal of the shock, was a negative reinforcer. Negative reinforcers and positive reinforcers both strengthen behavior. Quite frankly, negative reinforcers work better than positive reinforcers typically. That is, if the child is uncomfortable or in some kind of a deprivation state, and you remove you remove the discomfort, there's a better chance that the behavior that preceded the removal of the discomfort will continue. Think about that for a second. I have a good story to tell, and I will do that when we're face-to-face or on either face-to-face or on a live session about a parent, a mother I know, who uses, I believe, negative reinforcement very effectively to control her typically achieving children when they do not listen to her. So, by the way, we also distinguish between primary and secondary reinforcers, where primary reinforcers are things that strengthen behavior but do not require learning, biologic type things, such as food or the removal of electric shocks. By the way, I know electric shock is, I'm not in any way advocating this. I'm on videotape here. I'm going to be in big trouble by talking about it. I don't in any way advocate it. I'm just saying it can serve as a negative reinforcer and was used for many years clinically. When I was, again, starting out, it was in fact legal. It was used in my first teaching job at the university level was at Monmouth College, which is now Monmouth University in New Jersey. And there was a center down there that used these kinds of techniques. They're used less frequently these days, although they're not unheard of, interestingly enough. In any event, primary reinforcers, they require no learning. Secondary reinforcers do require learning. So if you say, for them to be effective, if you say good talking, the child has to have some language to understand the word good for it to ultimately have an effect, typically. If you give a child a token, the child has to have some idea that you collect tokens and ultimately can trade them in for a prize, or has to be into making collections of some sort for you to expect tokens to be successful. The secondary reinforcers require learning. Primary reinforcers don't. Again, primary reinforcers typically are most effective. Primary reinforcers combined with negative reinforcement, negative primary reinforcers, things that take away deprivation states, they are the most effective, I would say, in intervention. I'm going to continue on with extinction in a moment. I somehow misplaced my PowerPoint slide. You'll see it on the ASD PowerPoint, which is posted for you. But I'll just talk and won't show up in a corner here, and simply state that punishment does away with behaviors, not like reinforces with strengthened behaviors. Punishment is a punishment, or an extinguisher is an extinguisher, if subsequent to the consequence, behavior goes away or is reduced in frequency. Again, punishment and extinction are consequences. Extinguishers are consequences. They occur after a behavior, and their effect is to reduce the strength of the behavior. A punishment is something that's added to the person, like a whack in the behind, or taking something like that, and that again is a punishment only if behavior reduces in frequency. If behavior increases after you smack somebody, then the smack really was a reinforcer, a reward. It was a reinforcer. Strangely enough, usually consequences of any sort end up reinforcing behavior. Physical punishment is in no way recommended, and abuse typically leads to the strengthening of behavior and subsequent abusive behavior by the person to whom the abuse was applied. It is in no way recommended. Extinguishers involve the taking away of something, usually the taking away of a consequence, which is most effective. In other words, after a behavior that you don't want, if you do not respond to it, the odds are that the behavior will weaken. For example, I had a case of a child whose maybe not her first words, but her primary statement at a 3-year-old with a language delay, she did learn to say, "I hate you." And she would say that especially to her mother and especially in public. "I hate you." So the mother was extremely upset and wanted that "I hate you" behavior to go away. And the mother's response to the "I hate you" behavior was to grab the child or whack the child in her behind. None of that was working. And I suggested first that when I was hired as a clinician, number one, I don't think the child's meaning of the word hate is the same as an adult's meaning. I don't know if this child even understands what the word hate means. Somehow the child learned that particular phrase and got a reaction from mom every single time she said it. So clearly all the responses that the mom was making were reinforcers. So I suggested an extinction behavior, an extinction consequence. I suggested not responding at all. I said, let's not respond. Ignore it. Not only that, but if the child does anything else that you do like, you're going to ignore this. But if the child does something that's communicative and it doesn't even have to be verbal, for example, establishes eye gaze or reaches for your hand, we will respond to that behavior. It doesn't matter that the child says, "I hate you." Well, what we're doing is both working to extinguish the "I hate you" behavior and to strengthen more socially acceptable communication behavior by responding to it. And we did, in fact, wipe out the I hate you behavior very quickly. But what we did use an extinction technique, and that is we didn't respond. I treat a child now who has a habit of hitting himself and others and hits his head against the wall when he gets angry. And my interest was to extinguish the head banging behavior. And again, one thing I did was I patted an area, and then I let him bang his head away, or hit the padded area. I did not respond, and the effort was to reduce the frequency of behavior by taking away a consequence. Typically, two consequences of head banging probably were playing a role in this child's case. One is they were constantly told by an adult immediately thereafter to stop it, or was threatened or something, but that was a consequence, and it was not doing away with the behavior. So we can say those consequences were reinforcing. Also, probably his sense of proprioception and tactile sense was such that the threshold for pain and his need for proprioceptive input was high. His threshold for proprioception was high. So by banging his head, I suspected that it wasn't feeling to him like it feels to us. So by patting and taking away some of the feedback he was getting from the behavior, I was looking to extinguish it by taking away consequences. We definitely extinguished a lot of his aggressive behaviors in our treatment. In any event, this is so the two consequences we've been speaking about have been reinforcing consequences and punishing, extinguishing consequences. The idea being that consequences strengthen or weaken behavior. That is the bottom line, one of the bottom lines of operant intervention. Now, before I go to trials and to antecedents, let me simply say that part of the technology of operant intervention, part of the skill of us as clinicians in using these techniques, is to understand through study, really through research, a kind of research, what kinds of consequences serve to best strengthen behavior in a particular client and weaken behavior in a particular client. That is, what's reinforcing for particular clients. And for different clients, different things can be reinforcing. So for some clients, food would work. Other clients, tokens. Other clients, jumping up and down maybe on a trampoline if they have proprioceptive issues. In some clients, deprivation states, again, are the best things to create, best to work under deprivation with negative reinforcement. Maybe other clients can handle positive reinforcement and learned reinforcers. You have to do research and recognize that the only way you can identify a reinforcer is to study the behavior that you are targeting. And if it increases in frequency, you've got a reinforcer that's working. If it doesn't change, you've got a punishment or something that's entirely inconsequential. One other point, and that is there's typically two things always occurring in an operant intervention at the same time. The behavior you're paying attention to and following with the consequence is typically being strengthened. And the behaviors that are being ignored or punished, typically ignored, not responded to, those are going away. So both extinction and reinforcement are typically occurring simultaneously. So to do good operant intervention, it's quite complex and takes a lot of concentration and a lot of study. This is just an introduction to these techniques. that I'm sure you've had in other courses as well. If we have a chance to interact in a clinical setting, we will learn to really use these techniques in a more specific way. Let me talk next about antecedents and about trials. Okay, let me first talk about antecedents and then about trials. Consequences, again, are the things that can ultimately control behavior, but behavior occurs in a context, and antecedents also have to be considered. An antecedent is the event that precedes the expression of a behavior, and it serves to stimulate the operant. Something occurs before it stimulates it. Now, ABA programs and operant people talk about SDs, or discriminative stimuli. And those are the antecedents that ultimately stimulate a behavior. An SD can be typically some kind of a prompt from the clinician. It could be a verbal prompt, such as a directive, sit down, look at me, etc. It can be a physical prompt. You can physically push that child into the chair, or physically turn that child's head to look at you, which I do in no way recommend, but it's often done. Physical prompt, it could be a faded physical prompt, it can be a partial prompt. It can be something that is initially, again, intended to initiate the behavior, and that occurs before the behavior, and occurs before the behavior is actually learned or acquired. In the long run, it is the antecedent evolves, we hope certainly, from the reinforcer. It is the consequence that ultimately strengthens the behavior and ultimately cycles around to serve as the SD, as the thing that actually stimulates the behavior, when behavior then becomes spontaneous because it's expressed in a context ultimately towards the end of the reinforcer. I am not going to spend time talking about rates and programs of reinforcement. That is for a future date, perhaps. But again, stimulus generalization occurs when the stimulus is associated with the discriminative stimulus becomes the context evocative of the response. And that is typically the consequence that's associated with the behavior, and aspects of classical conditioning where there are pairings between the learned behavior and the antecedent. Now, in some cases, in many cases, again, the antecedent needs special study to understand what's initially prompting or stimulating a behavior. Again, the child with Rett syndrome that I worked with, that I'm showing you some videotapes of, had the habit initially when I started working with her of throwing her head back and breaking eye contact and social contact with me. And then she began playing with her breath. As you know, kids with Rett syndrome have breathing issues, and sometimes they'll actually play with their breath, their apnea. Actually, they play with apnea, interestingly enough. In any event, I wanted to know. I tried to figure out what was the antecedent to the throwing the head back. What was it that was serving to stimulate it? And I ultimately felt that it was, both the too much stimulation coming at once at her. She always needed a break from stimuli coming at her. Too much information to process at once. In any event, in the long run, that behavior also decreased, partly by I believe the engineering of consequences, both in response to that behavior and to behavior I was looking for, which was continued engagement in the task, and and by modifying the antecedent to some extent, especially by providing material to her that was developmentally appropriate and less, in a sense, less information and less sensory stimulation coming to her at once, by calming the environment down for her. That's a long story, but just to say that antecedents are very important in operant intervention, and they too need to be designed. And the final point I want to make is, it's another slide actually, so I'll stop for trials. One of the, I think, great things to come out of applied behavior analysis and the operant approach is the concept of running trials. Now, a trial begins with an antecedent, the SD, that initiates the behavior, continues through the child's expression of the target behavior, that is the behavior we set as a goal of intervention, and a trial ends with the giving of a consequence. So really what we want to do in therapy is have a child express the target behavior multiple times, because practice makes perfect. I don't care whether we are using an operant technique or we'll talk here about constructivist techniques, floor time techniques, play techniques, which are part of constructivism and the floor time. Whatever technique we're using, and whatever target behavior we're after, the more the child expresses it, the better off we are. The more learning will take place. We want the target behavior to be expressed multiple times during a clinical session. Therefore, the idea of running a trial where we do what's necessary to get the child to express the behavior, create a situation where the odds of expressing it are increased, and make sure that it leads to a consequence that leads to its re-expression, that is very good. So we often say the child will express a particular behavior 8 out of 10 trials, 7 out of 10 trials. That's how I write goals. I say, whether I'm playing with the child, whether the child's expressing a play schema, a content category, or a particular skill, such as drinking from a cup, any of those things, anything at all, I will say, child will express, will produce, respond to, whatever, 8 out of 10 trials, X out of Y trials. I use the term trials. And that is also part of operant intervention and the ABA approach. That's all I have to say about operant intervention right now. I'm going to, in subsequent videotapes, video lectures, I will address floor time and constructivist intervention. At the very end, I will talk about evidence that supports or doesn't support any or all of these approaches. Thank you.